All right. Hello, St. John's community and anybody else who might be tuning in with us tonight. Welcome back to week 2 of the Church History Summer Series, specifically on the Protestant Reformation. For anyone who doesn't know, my name is Danielle Kuhn. I am the Director of Faith Formation at St. John's. Yes, I'm sorry. Father Daniel and Father Umberto are not teaching this series. You have me. I do youth group and RE, and I teach RCIA at St. John's. Not sure how many times I'm going to keep introducing myself at the beginning of all these sessions, but for now, I just feel like I owe it to the people. So, for anyone who wasn't here last week, you can watch the whole talk. It's on Father Daniel's YouTube channel. If you just look back in his old videos, we talk about why it's really important to know the history of the Protestant Reformation and understand what was going on with the church and the surrounding world at that time, as well as the investiture controversy, which occurred in the 11th century, which is kind of an important thing to know to preface what we're going into today, which will then preface what we go into not next week, but the week after, when we actually start getting into the actual happenings of the Reformation, starting with Luther. Right now, for this week and next week as well, we are talking about the historical events that preceded the Reformation that gave the world historical fertile soil for the Reformation to occur. It kind of set the scene. It basically just set up the world to be ripe for the Reformation. And it's really important to understand all of these preceding events because the Reformation doesn't just occur in a vacuum, it occurs in response to something. So if we look at the Reformation by itself, we miss out on a lot unless we know the preceding events and historical context, cultural overtones that were going on during the time period directly before it, because the Reformation happened in response to a lot of these things. Specifically today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Black Death, a number of internal crises for the church, and the abuse of indulgences. That's a big one that a lot of Catholics today don't really know how to talk about or understand very well. Indulgences in general are things that Catholics don't know a lot about. For a lot of us, it's just like, oh, weren't those kind of icky things that caused a lot of problems in the Middle Ages, and we don't really understand if we still even have them today, which, spoiler, we do, or what was going on with the abuse of indulgences back in the 1400s and 1300s. If we have time, we'll also get into the university system. Okay, I also want to say that I heard from a few people that I talked too fast for questions, or at least I went on to the next subject before a question could come up. So I have a big jar of water, and I'm going to remind myself to take drinks of it often so people have time to ask questions in the comments, which I can see live as they come in, if you have any, starting now. I'm so sorry if you guys can hear me drinking too, or swallowing. Okay, with all of those things said, let's start with the Black Death. So the Black Death it's not like it was confined to a very set time period. It kind of lasted over a number of centuries, and there kept being reoccurrences, second waves, third waves, fourth waves of it that popped up. But the bulk of it was during the early 1300s, especially 1340s. Around 30% of Europe's population died, which is huge, and there are some estimates which put the numbers even higher. It was not uncommon for entire villages to be wiped out or reduced to half the population that they had been before. This was something that was often seen as a divine punishment at the time. The culture of the time period was very much that bad things that happened were seen as physical manifestations of divine punishment. Good things that happened were seen as physical manifestation of blessing. And we'll talk more about why that was when we talk about medieval piety practices next week. People, when bad things happen, people want to find someone to blame. So there was a good deal of anti-Semitic sentiment that arose from this, people blaming the Jews for the Black Death. Urban areas were hit incredibly hard, so it really affected city life. And it led to a lot of economic changes. When you have a ton of the population wiped out really quickly overnight, it actually led to increased wages. There was less people to work, therefore work was more valued, so people paid more to the people who were still alive and could work. There was more food to go around, there was more money to go around. It sounds really terrible, but economically it kind of had some beneficial impacts once you got past the initial horrible toll of death and destruction. It also led to increased mobility. So a lot of family ties were destroyed when you have your whole family, say, wiped out, besides maybe you and your husband and your kids. You no longer feel so tied to a certain place. In fact, you might want to get up and leave that place because now you have horrible memories of the Black Death and all the sadness and disease that went on in your hometown that maybe your family had lived in for centuries, but now you're totally ready to be done with. So with these old ties destroyed, there was a lot more mobility. With a lot more mobility led to an increased circulation of ideas and culture. It wasn't so stagnant. It wasn't so, oh, this is the way we've always done it. Because people started moving around more, there was a lot more, just interchange of ideas and ways of life. In addition, there were a lot of technological innovations that resulted from the Black Death because there was a shortage of workers. So people had to come up with a lot of new technologies that could help them deal with the problem of having less people to do the same amount of work. So a lot of innovations in farming and manufacturing, what was manufacturing at the time, the impetus for them was the Black Death. Also, after the Black Death, there was this residual effect of kind of an obsession with death, or an obsession with just really reckoning with your own mortality. And you can see this a lot in artwork. There's a lot of death in artwork during this time period. Exhibit A. Exhibit B, a lot of skeletons. Not the most uplifting and heartwarming time for art. Another skeleton. And a huge painting of just, in general, death, destruction. There's some skeletons over here on the left. All that to say, there was a lot of death, and death was on the mind of a lot of people. And what this did culturally was it made people think about end times, divine retribution, and their relationship with their God and their own mortality a lot. So, Black Death happened. Next, there were a number of internal crises during the church, within the church during this time. Now, last class we talked about the investiture controversy, which happened in the 11th century. I should have taken a sip of water. A lot of that intermingling of church and state and the problems that caused was still around during the 1300s and the 1400s, and it led to a lot of different internal crises. Luther, who begins as an Augustinian Catholic monk, Luther inherits a lot of this unrest and disgruntlement and issues within the church when he comes about in the late 1400s, early 1500s. So another cultural aspect to note that kind of caused or contributed to some of these issues with the church is that there was sort of a general ideological worldview shift during this time period. In the secular world, among state rulers, there was a lot of consolidation of power. So earlier, there would have been a medieval period where you have the lord of a certain area and he has his own knights and there are serfs, and it's very much like city-states like that. And maybe they're all loosely tied under the name of France, but it is loosely. During the late 1300s, 1400s, there's a lot more centralization of that power. So nobles, individual lords, city-states have less power, and instead central monarchs and rulers are gaining more power. Not so much for the Holy Roman Emperor. He's still, like we said last class, Germany's continually a country that has a weak central ruler and a lot of powerful city-states. But for places like Spain, for places like France and England, even Italy was getting a little bit more centralized, having super powerful families like the Medici come about. There was just a general shift of looking more at temporal reality. You had a greater allegiance to France and a greater allegiance to the country of England because you had this centralization of power. So people were finding more identity in who was their ruler, in what their country was. That was becoming increasingly important. So the temporal status was really raised of these nations. It wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was really important to the French people that they were French, and we love our king and we love being French, and likewise for Italy and Spain and England. The church during this time period is holding more onto the medieval worldview because an increase in the temporal powers, in the power of centralized monarchs, threatens and scares the church, because it has this history of monarchs wanting to tell the church what pope it should appoint and wanting to appoint the church's bishops. So the church during this time period, seeing the King of France and the King of England and the King of Spain become more powerful, did not make the church comfortable. It's not happy about that. And there were a number of church leaders that got involved in a kind of power struggle with these secular rulers, which was not good for the church. People no longer saw the Pope as much as a leader of the Western world, and they more saw their own countries as leaders of the Western world. Second, we have the spiritual Franciscans. So this is not a big thing, but it's worth noting that Saint Francis of Assisi, not during the 1400s, but earlier than that, he came about and was this beloved figure. He was made a saint only 2 years after he died, which is insanely fast for a saint. He was a very beloved figure who radically embraced poverty. And he never wrote any challenges to the church, never made any big declarations condemning anything done by the church, but simply by the way he acted and the Franciscan order that he created, which embraced radical poverty and made poverty an example of beautiful virtue. He made a few church leaders kind of uncomfortable. Like for a while, church hierarchy really didn't want to allow St. Francis to create his order, because his order was based on this idea that we need to live simply. We need to embrace humility, and one way of embracing humility can be done through poverty, and really cast a bad light on having a lot of material goods. During this time period, we still have a lot of state and church intermingling. So not only are there definitely some church priests, bishops who live excessively lavish lifestyles and have a little bit too much material wealth, but we have those priests and bishops who were made priests and bishops by the ruler of whatever country that they're in, because that was still a thing. Even though the investiture controversy officially said that rulers couldn't do that, unofficially they did it all the time. And those bishops and priests were especially uncomfortable with Francis because they definitely had a lot of wealth and power, and he didn't make them look good. So St. Francis never goes about writing a 95 Theses or anything like that, but just by his presence and his ministry and the spirituality that his order expressed scared some church leaders and caused a lot of ripples because, again, St. Francis was made a saint 2 years after he died, which just points to how much he was loved during his lifetime, and how he was already revered as very, very holy while he lived. So a lot of people are saying, hey, this guy is embracing poverty and he's a really holy guy, and I'm seeing a lot of my church officials who live lives of utter wealth and luxury, and something is not adding up. So Franciscans are creating ripples. Then we have the Avignon Papacy. This was another mess. The Western Schism resulted from this. Long story short, this was a brief period of time where for 70 plus years, the papacy picked up its whole self with all of its assistants and magistrates and helpers and people, fancy robes, and moved to Avignon, France. Just moved the whole papacy, which is an issue because the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. And that line of succession comes from Peter being the first Bishop of Rome. So the papacy getting up out of Rome and moving to Avignon, France was a big deal because it was the Pope abandoning his post as Bishop of Rome. So how did this happen? Okay, so it starts with Boniface VIII and Philip IV of France. Philip IV of France was also known as Philip the Fair, not to be confused with Philip IV of Spain, who was apparently a lot less fair. Philip of Spain is in the middle. France Philip is off to the right. Anyways, I digress. So Boniface VIII, Philip IV. They get in an argument. So Philip wanted to tax the church. He wanted to have the church have to pay a sum of their donations, tithes that came to the church to the French king. Now, this kind of makes Philip seem really, really terrible, and what he did was not great. But to give a little background, during this time, the church had a not awesome practice of enforcing their own tax. So it was like a tithe that was forced on you. You have to tithe this amount. Today, there is an option to tithe, and you should tithe to the church, but there is no forcing you to tithe, and there is no set amount that you have to tithe. During this time period, there were churches that did that. They had an enforced tithe, and this made Philip annoyed. He's like, what? The church gets their own personal tax that they get to enforce on their people, and I don't get any of that? I'm the king. I'm the one who should have taxes. If they have a tax, I should have a stake in that. Not only was Philip annoyed at the church for this tax issue, but he also really didn't like that the church disciplined their own. So the church staunchly said, if a clergy commits a crime, we are the ones who are going to carry out the punishment. We'll judge them. We'll kind of have our own court of law with them. Philip doesn't like this, one, because it undermines his power. And it especially undermines his power because, two, the church's punishments were a lot less severe. So the church didn't actually torture. The church didn't torture anyone when they tried them, and they didn't have capital punishment. A lot of people think that the church did do a ton of torture during the time of the Spanish Inquisition. That's not actually true. It was always the state doing the torture. Now, sometimes it was like the church kind of like, oh, you're doing torture? It's fine. I'll just look away. I'm not seeing this. It's fine. So the church still had some occasionally not so good things that happened with the Spanish Inquisition, but the hierarchy of the church itself never tortured and didn't do capital punishment. That was always just the secular rulers that did that. So Philip doesn't like this because he's like, you're not even giving them good punishments. You're just weak sauce over there with your kind of slapping their wrist and saying, pray more and repent, and then you can go back. So Philip was just against the church having what seemed to him, and kind of was, just their own special rules, which were exempt from the state's rules. Philip thinks the church is just getting too uppity, too much power, and he is, after all, Philip the Fair. He gets what he wants because of his pretty face. And he has come into a good deal of power. Again, countries were becoming more centralized, so Philip at this time period was enjoying a lot more power than French kings had enjoyed in the past. He decides that the church needs to be knocked down a peg. They need to learn their place and know that their place is underneath Philip IV, below him. So in 1302, Boniface VIII responds to Philip IV's attempts to tax the church by issuing the papal bull, papal letter, Unam Sanctam, which means one holy church, which says that the church is superior to secular rulers. So Boniface definitely makes Philip mad, because Philip was initially mad because he's like, all these practices make it look like the church is superior to secular rulers, and I don't like that. And Boniface comes back and he's like, yeah, the church is superior to secular rulers. I'm going to put it in an official letter. Bam. What you were afraid of? Yes, I'm going to double down on that. So Philip is super mad. He's extremely incensed at Boniface. He's so mad that he hires a group of, I've seen it in multiple different historical books described as goons. He hires some goons to go to Rome and kill the Pope. But they're supposed to assassinate Boniface VIII. They go down there. They don't succeed in killing him because the people would lose their minds if that happened. But they do get him thrown in prison for a while. Eventually, Boniface is released from prison because people were wildly upset that this guy in France just sent some goons to come down and throw the Pope in prison. They thought that was totally not okay, which it wasn't okay. But prison had really done a number on Boniface's health, and he dies shortly after his release from prison. So now is the part where we see how the papacy eventually got moved to France. Because at this point, you're like, why would the papacy move to France? France tried to assassinate the Pope. This doesn't make sense. Boniface the eighth's successor, he's afraid of France a little bit, and he wants to placate France as a country. He's like, oh, Boniface got thrown in prison by some goons. I want to make the French a little bit happier. So he appoints a good number of French priests to be cardinals, French bishops to be cardinals, to kind of make France feel like they have more of a foot in the papacy, or they're more recognized. This ends up kind of backfiring, though, because Clement V is elected the Pope in 1305, and Clement V is a French guy. A French guy got elected because of all the new French cardinals that had come in. Now, there were a lot of other other circumstances going on in Rome at this time. Like there was a lot of political unrest. Rome was rioting. There was a new surge of the plague. So Clement V in general, he's feeling a little uncomfortable being in Rome. It's a little icky. And he is, after all, a Frenchman. So he decides, all right, we're leaving. We're picking up the whole papacy and we're moving to France. And that's what they end up doing. They move the papacy to Avignon, to this beautiful, very medieval looking palace. Also scary looking. It looks like a dungeon or, I don't know, some sort of intense fortress. But this is where the papacy moves to in Avignon, France. 6 more popes come and go, and the whole Vatican is still in Avignon, which again is not okay with the people of the church, because they're like, the Bishop of Rome just up and left Rome. The Bishop of Rome has vacated the area. And this was already a huge problem for bishops. Absentee bishops was a thing. But to have the Pope be an absentee bishop was really not a good look for the church. And it's followed by a number of not so good looks for the church. So finally, Gregory the 11th becomes Pope. There are so many Gregory popes and John popes. But Gregory the 11th becomes Pope, different from Gregory the 7th, who we talked about last time. And he, upon the urging of St. Catherine of Siena, moves the papacy back to Rome. If you don't know that much about St. Catherine of Siena, take some time to look her up. She is an incredibly strong-willed woman. She was single and not part of a religious order. She was just a very holy woman. And the degree of influence and audacity and boldness and holiness that she had during her lifetime is awesome, especially being a woman in this time period. She was just absolutely fearless. She just goes to Gregory the 11th and says, hey, get your butt back to Rome. What are you doing here? You're being stupid and ridiculous. So he does. He listens to her. She's not the only one telling him to go back to Rome. But Gregory moves everything back to Rome. Good job, St. Catherine of Siena. She's a doctor of the church, by the way. One of the 4 female doctors of the church. I think there's 4. Water. Okay, so Gregory moves the papacy back. However, shortly after this, Gregory dies. The Italian people in Rome are really pressuring all the cardinals to appoint an Italian pope. So they do. They vote in Urban the VI. He was elected. But he was not maybe the best guy for the job. He was really nervous and paranoid, and he really alienated himself quite quickly. The French cardinals weren't even that happy about having to elect an Italian pope in the first place. So add the fact that they already didn't really like Urban VI, add to that he was a really paranoid guy that would shut himself up in his rooms and didn't want to talk to anyone because he was really nervous about goons coming and throwing him in jail. And he did not have a lot of friends, and any friends that he did have, he quickly lost because of his erratic behavior. So the cardinals decide that they're going to declare Urban VI null and void. They're like, the election, that was fake. That was a void election. It wasn't really real. And they say that they depose Urban VI. He has not been consulted on this. And decide that they are going to appoint a new pope, and they elect Clement VII. Lots of Clements, too. Clement up and takes the papacy back to Avignon. But Urban VI is still in Rome, and he was elected by a fair process. He was elected by the cardinals. He is a valid pope. So now we've got an issue because we have a papacy in Avignon and we have a papacy in Rome, and we've got 2 different popes. We are again in a situation with 2 different popes. But both were technically valid because both were elected by a majority of cardinals. So people were left with this very difficult situation of who's the real pope here. This was the Western Schism. We had 2 different lines of popes going. And it only gets worse for a little bit. So cardinals got together in 1409 at the Council of Pisa to try to solve this. They say, okay, great, you know what? Get rid of these guys. We won't have Clement VII. We won't have Urban VI. We'll have a new pope entirely, and they elect. I don't have his name in my notes. Dang, okay, I can't remember his name right now, but they elect a third pope. So now we have 3 popes, and they've all been elected by a majority of cardinals. So now everyone is feeling even more, what the heck? Who is the real pope? What are we supposed to be doing? This lasts for a while longer, and then finally, in 1414, the Council of Constance starts. And it lasts 3 years. 3 years. So 1409 all the way to 1417, that's 8 years where they had 3 popes. But finally, at the conclusion of the Council of Constance, they successfully depose all 3 popes. So at Pisa, they tried to depose Urban VI and Clement II, but they weren't really successful because they thought that both of those popes would just be like, oh yeah, it's cool, we won't be pope anymore. All right, you elected a new guy, we'll step down. This time at the Council of Constance, they forced them to step down, and they elected Martin V. And he was the pope. This, as you might imagine, really hurt the church's image. This was not good PR. It is not good PR to have this much infighting and issues about who the actual pope is. It's not good PR for the Bishop of Rome to just up and leave Rome and go to France for a little while. 1, because you're abandoning your bishopric, the post that the pope is supposed to be at. And 2, now it looks like the French have kind of control over the papacy. The whole time the papacy was in Avignon, the French really had too much authority over the pope. So there was a lot of loss of legitimacy. I mean, can you imagine being a Catholic during this time period, and for like an entire lifetime, you could be a person who's like, I don't really know who the pope is. The pope's gone. There's 3 popes right now. So to a lot of the laity, it was like, our church leaders are being crazy. Our church leaders are nonsensical. What's happening with them? So this did some damage to how bishops and the popes looked. Okay, that's the Avignon Papacy, which was solved by the Council of Constance, with Martin V being the pope, the one pope that was elected and settled on from then on. I'm going to drink water for anyone who has a question, and then we're going to move on to indulgences. Okay, I'm really excited to talk about indulgences because they are pretty misunderstood, I think, by a lot of people and a lot of Catholics, which is understandable, as we'll see getting into them. So first, we want to start with, what is an indulgence? So at the core, an indulgence is a theological gift of God's grace. That seems kind of vague, though, because there are a lot of things that are theological gifts of God's grace. Yes, exactly. That's kind of the point. Sacraments are gifts, theological gifts of God's grace, ways that God can give his grace, mediate his grace to his people. And indulgences are another thing like that, but they're different than sacraments, very different. So they remove temporal consequences of sin. If you didn't know, I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell you this, but there are actually 2 different types of consequences for sin. There is the eternal consequence, and there is the temporal consequence. So the eternal consequence is what Jesus' death on the cross atoned for. The eternal consequence of sin is break in relationship with God, so being separated from God. Jesus' death on the cross atones for that, repairs that, allows us to be in relationship with God, fixes that broken connection. Temporal consequences are not as dire because they're not eternal, right? But they're still a thing. And that's more like, they are more like the weakening of our souls from sin. So you can think of it like if you tore a ligament in your shoulder and you had to have surgery, after that surgery, the tear would be fixed. It would be all sewn back up. And that would be like your eternal consequence. There was a tear, there was a break. After the surgery, after Jesus' death on the cross, the break can be fixed, sewn back up. However, you still have a lot of weakness in that shoulder now that you have to repair because of that injury that was done to your shoulder. Similarly with sin, when we sin, there is weakening that is done to our souls. And this maybe seems confusing, but it's actually pretty intuitive. If you think of some sin in your life ever that the first time you did it, you were really torn up about it and really conflicted, and in some ways it was really hard because your conscience was really, really loud. But then as time went on, you didn't resist the sin as much. You just kind of slipped into it. You felt like you didn't have any ability to fight it anymore. That's the kind of temporal weakening of the soul that occurs as a consequence of sin. When we sin, it does damage to our souls in that it takes away some of their strength. So, oh my goodness. Where indulgences tie into that is that indulgences take away that temporal consequence. So they are a way of strengthening our souls. If you can think of after you have that shoulder tear and you have the shoulder surgery, then you go to physical therapy so you can strengthen the shoulder again. You have to work out the shoulder to repair kind of the weakness that has come about in those muscles. Indulgences are kind of like physical therapy for your soul. They are working on removing those temporal consequences of sin. Side note, this is one reason that purgatory exists. Because even if you went to confession, all the eternal consequences of your sin was totally gone, your relationship with God was completely restored and put right, you might still have temporal consequences of sin on your soul. So like if you died right after confession, you might still have to go to purgatory because you can have desires and attachments to worldly things that are formed by sin. A good example of that would be any kind of addiction. You can go to confession, confess any kind of sin related to addiction, but doing that doesn't necessarily remove the weakness in your will that addiction has caused, and the disordered attachments to worldly things that might be a part of that addiction. So purgatory has that role there. It purifies the soul from any attachments to earthly or evil, wrong things. Okay, where was I? Indulgences, like physical therapy for the soul. They're like spiritual exercises for our soul. They give graces that strengthen it. This does not mean that indulgences are like instant miracles, just like physical therapy isn't a miracle, right? Like you can't just show up to physical therapy and be like, I'm here. Shouldn't I be stronger now? I've done the thing. I've come to physical therapy. No, you actually have to go through exercises and purposefully devote your will to strengthening those muscles again. Similarly, with an indulgence, you have to exercise your soul, if you will, and have that intention of spirit to bettering and strengthening yourself. You have to have that desire and that movement of the will towards God. So it's not like a miracle thing. And also, it's not like something where if you did get an indulgence, you're not necessarily always going to feel magically better right away. Just like when you receive the Eucharist, you don't always feel those graces that are being truly poured into your soul at that moment. In confirmation, you don't always feel the graces of the Holy Spirit and the gifts of Holy Spirit that you receive during that sacrament. Graces do not equate to feelings, and that's an important thing to know when we're talking about God's grace. So indulgences aren't like magical therapy pills. They are things that require an active movement of your own will, but they are spiritual exercises that are meant to strengthen the soul. You still have to put in the work though. Your heart has to be open, striving to God. Yeah. Oh, in my notes I wrote, like in confirmation, when you receive the sacrament of confirmation. It's not like Peter Parker when he gets bit by a spider and all of a sudden he's like, ugh, spider powers. That's not how the Holy Spirit works. He's a lot more subtle and a lot more beautiful because of that subtlety. Okay, so what exactly is involved in an indulgence? This is so important to understanding the whole abuse of indulgences. So really pay attention here. It's very key. Okay, so in any indulgence, plenary or partial, there are 4 components, things that you have to do, things incorporated into the spiritual exercises. So there's like 4 different spiritual exercises you have to actively do to receive these graces. You need to pray for the intentions of the Pope. This represents unity of the church. You are actively participating in that unity. So you pray for the intentions of the Pope. 2, you go to confession. Because of course, in order to receive these graces, you have to be in a state whereby you can receive graces. If you are in a state of mortal sin, your relationship with God is kind of broken. It's cut off. By that act of mortal sin, you've cut off that relationship of grace with God, so you can't actually receive graces that he wants to give you through the sacraments or through an indulgence. So you have to go to confession. That's really important because there are so many people who won't go and do the spiritual exercises of an indulgence because of the confession part. You have to go to confession. 3, you have to receive the Eucharist because, of course, you have to receive the Eucharist. That's an amazing gift of God's grace and a really important part of exercising our souls. So 1, praying for the intentions of the Pope. 2, going to confession. 3, receiving the Eucharist. And then 4, doing whatever the indulgence thing is. And this is always going to be either prayer, fasting, or almsgiving. So those are all works of faith that you can do, things that exercise your soul and kind of grow your spiritual muscles. Prayer, fasting, or almsgiving. The 4th thing will always be one of those 3 things. And so that could be praying the Stations of the Cross. It could be doing a certain fast on a certain day. It could be almsgiving, which means giving of something of yours to somebody else. So that could be giving of your time, that could be giving of your money, that could be giving of... There are other things that are yours besides your time and your money, but I can't think of any right now. But it means giving of something of yourself to others. That 4th indulgence piece, the part where you do some kind of spiritual act, is often what indulgences are reduced to. So instead of saying, no, an indulgence is a theological gift of grace, and to obtain it, you have to do kind of this spiritual, physical therapy for your soul to get rid of these temporal consequences of sin, because you just need to strengthen your soul to get rid of those consequences. Instead of saying, yeah, you have to pray for the intentions of the Pope, go to confession, go to communion, and do this 1/4 thing, whatever that is, it is very, very often reduced to, oh, I just have to do that 4th thing. And you can see how that makes it much more vulnerable to being abused. Because people don't like to be told that they have to go to confession for something. Confession is hard and difficult and requires humbling of ourselves. Confession is definitely something that people like to avoid in the medieval period. There were many, many nobles who would go to confession once and then never go to confession again or receive the Eucharist again, because if you didn't go to confession, you didn't receive the Eucharist until they died, and then they would just do a deathbed confession. So that part, the receiving communion, praying for the intentions of the Pope, and going to confession, was often kind of really downplayed. Like, oh, tack it on in really small font at the end, but in big letters say the one fasting, prayer, or almsgiving thing that you have to do to obtain the indulgence. So it created among the people And today, many people still have this idea that you can get an indulgence just by donating to something, or you can get an indulgence just by saying a couple Our Fathers. You can get an indulgence if you just do the one thing that the church says. And you can see why that seems suspicious, because it seems like the church has come up with this really clever way of getting people to do what they want by saying that they get a special spiritual gift if they do the thing. Which is why it's really important to see the indulgence as a whole and not just as that 1/4 component. You need to see it holistically as a spiritual physical therapy exercise meant to strengthen the soul and heal it from the effects of the temporal consequences of sin. A second reason that, I had a second reason. I'm forgetting it now. A second reason this indulgences are often misunderstood is they were often portrayed as, oh, if you do this, you go straight to heaven. If you do this one thing, skip the purgatory line, like boom, you can buy your way to heaven. Because the confession, the Eucharist, and the praying for the intentions of the Pope were often downplayed or just not included when talking about indulgences, people often got this idea that, oh, if I donate to the right cause, I can go to heaven straight away. Like, I just have to pay enough money and then I get a one-way ticket to heaven. Awesome. That's fantastic. I really didn't want to have to do that confession thing because that's super embarrassing and humiliating. That is not how an indulgence works. You cannot buy your way to heaven. There is no set system of calculations. Though during this time period, that's what was created a lot of times. Like, people wanted to come up with the perfect equation for how to get to heaven. They're like, how can I make it as specific as possible and as like set in stone so I can know with certainty? Remember, the Black Death happened, and that created a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, a lot of thinking about your mortality, this kind of focus on and obsession with death. And so in thinking about that, people want to have some degree of control. They've had no control throughout the 1300s when this plague was ravaging the country. So people want to have some sort of control. And so indulgences become these things where, oh, if I just do X, Y, and Z, I can just go to heaven straight away. That's all I have to do. I just have to donate this amount of money. I just have to say 2 Hail Marys on a Wednesday, and I have to do a pilgrimage, and that's all. Indulgences can reduce time in purgatory because indulgences take away that temporal consequence of sin, and that's also what purgatory exists to do. But there is no equation. There is no, if you do this many Hail Marys, you get a ticket straight to heaven. It's really interesting that Luther hated the abuse of indulgences, and rightly so. But he hated this idea of people calculating exactly what you have to do to be saved. He didn't like it at all. And Luther's Reformation is a response against that. He doesn't want to have this codified rule book of what you have to do to be saved. Paradoxically, though, it's really interesting. You see in the Reformation, not at first with Luther, but by the end of his life, yes, and then with other Reformation leaders like in the Swiss Reformers or Calvinists, although the Reformation began as this response pushing against having an exact certain thing that means that you're saved, it kind of ends up in the exact same boat, because it ends up being like, oh, if you say these words, if you say, I commit myself to Christ, then you are saved. If you say, I've accepted God in my life and I have faith, then you are saved. So it kind of ends up in this odd full circle. Anyways, though, So indulgences, people often thought, oh, if I just do X, Y, and Z, I can buy my way to heaven. And there were a lot of bishops and priests who were like, oh, you think you can buy your way to heaven, so you're going to donate a ton of money or give me money? Yeah, I'm not going to question that. Like, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. Sure, if you think an indulgence just means you have to donate, that's fine. Because maybe if I told you all the things an indulgence actually involves, you wouldn't be interested anymore. If I told you that it involves going to receive the Eucharist and going to confession, you might bail. I should say, during this time period too, people very rarely received the Eucharist. I'm not saying we don't today, but maybe not to the same degree, and that might be something that our church is lacking today, but they had a really deep reverence for the Eucharist, so you would not receive the Eucharist unless you had gone to confession either right before or the day before, but it had to be really close together. And so because so many people wouldn't go to confession or were scared to, a lot of people didn't receive the Eucharist. So an indulgence was kind of asking a lot of the people, for many of them, because this was not something they did regularly at all. So there were a lot of bishops and priests who kind of just left off all those other things, all those other spiritual good exercises involved in indulgence, and allowed the laity to think that, oh, I just need to donate this amount of money and then I go to heaven. Great, because I was really worried about my salvation and I need some control in my life. So I love this, that the church has come up with this payment plan for heaven. So I want to talk about one specific example of how corrupt it could get with indulgences and bishops. And this involves Bishop Albrecht of Mainz in Germany. His Anglicanized name is Albert, which is a lot easier to say than Albrecht, so I'm going to call him Albert. But before I say that, I just want to say, it's important to note that the church never taught that it was okay to sell indulgences. That was never okay, never has been okay, never will be okay. It is not okay to sell indulgences. It is improper preaching and improper understanding of the laity that leads to that assumption that you can buy indulgences. You can't. It's not possible. You can't actually buy an indulgence. You can pay money and you don't get an indulgence for that. Okay, so before we get into Albert here, Pope Leo X, wanting to raise money for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which if you've ever been there, you can understand why it needed a lot of money to be raised. He allowed for the distribution of that fourth part of an indulgence if you donated to St. Peter's. So if you donated to St. Peter's and went to confession and went to Eucharist and prayed for the Pope's intentions, then you could receive an indulgence. Oftentimes, though, of course, people just said, oh, donate to the cathedral, the basilica in Rome, and you get an indulgence. Again, leaving out all those other three important components. Never explicitly were indulgences talked about as for sale, but they were ostensibly offered for the donation. But it came off to a lot of people as if you could buy it. You could say that there was a bit of a dishonest marketing campaign. So Bishop Albert in Germany took advantage of this fact. He was named the bishop of two different sees, or bishoprics, so basically areas which a bishop is in charge of, simultaneously at 23 years old, which is already breaking a bunch of canon laws, because you aren't allowed to be a bishop at the age of 23, and you aren't allowed to have two different bishoprics. Then the Diocese of Mainz opens up, M-A-I-N-Z, and that is like a juicy looking diocese because it's very powerful. You get a lot of wealth if you're the bishop of that. So Albert is like, Mainz, I already have two bishoprics. Mainz looks good too. I want it. But he's going to have to pay off the Pope in order to get this exception to let him have it. The Pope is like, man, I really want this basilica to be finished. Okay, if you pay me, I think it was 20,000 ducats. 20,000 ducats is whatever the currency was at the time. 20,000 ducats, I will let you have a third bishopric. So Albert pays the Pope 20,000 for the basilica as a donation to the basilica, and then he pays straight up 10,000 ducats for the bishopric of Mainz. And he is now the bishop of 3 different bishoprics. Remember earlier I said there was a problem with absentee bishops? Albert wasn't even really at any of these dioceses. He had his own castle that he would go spend time at. He just liked having the power and the prestige. So this was definitely against church law, super duper against church law. And all of this paying off for illegal favors really was putting Albert in debt. So he was like, I'm authorized to distribute an indulgence for the donation of money to St. Peter's. So I'm really, really going to heavily advertise that. Then I'll keep half the donations and send the other half to Rome. So he was just stealing from the people. People would donate and he would steal half of their donations to pay off his debt, the debt that he had because he corruptly got himself 3 different bishoprics. This is just one example, one of the worst examples, but it was this kind of manipulation of indulgences that was the abuse. The church, again, was never straight up selling them, but had a dishonest marketing campaign because they weren't actually telling the people like, no, you can't buy these. You have to do a lot of other things. It's a spiritual exercise. We need to do some spiritual physical therapy. They did not focus on any of those tougher to do things and instead allowed people to focus on just the, oh, I just need to donate part. So there was this phrase called, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Again, the abuse of indulgences in this way created among the laity this idea that I can pay my way to heaven, I can pray enough Hail Marys to get me to heaven. This idea of, oh, I just need to do a thing, like a heavy, heavy focus on all I have to do is a certain work and I go to heaven. Of course, that's not true if you aren't actively with your will seeking God, if you aren't striving with your heart towards God. So if you aren't authentic in these acts of charity and piety that you do, they are worth nothing. Just like if you're in a relationship, if you're married and you do a ton of things for a person, but you're not affectionate with them, or you're just doing all of these nice things, chores around the house, so that they'll, allow you to play golf later. That's not real love, and that's not what God wants. So this emphasis on works was an unhealthy emphasis. It was an emphasis on, oh, I can just do these things and I don't necessarily have to have the faith. I don't necessarily have to have an actual relationship with God. I don't actually have to love God. I just have to pray a certain amount of Hail Marys or donate a certain amount. And you can see why people latched onto this because, again, Black Death, it was a time of uncertainty. It was a time of upheaval. They want some kind of control in their life. And this offers an illusion of control. Like, oh, I can control my salvation if I just say these Hail Marys. It'll be great. But that's not how God works, and that's not how salvation works. And we'll talk a lot more about that because it's a focal point of the Reformation. But I guess I would want to end just in this last minute thinking about the story in Scripture with the rich young man. The rich young man kind of exemplifies the attitude that medieval people had during this time period. The rich young man comes to Jesus and he says, I follow all the commandments. What else do I have to do to be saved? And in the end, he leaves sad because the rich young man was asking the wrong question from the beginning. The question should never be, what is the bare minimum I can do to earn salvation? If that's your question, you're already in the wrong business. You're not in the business of faith. You're not in the business of having a relationship with God. You're in the business of doing the minimum amount of work to save yourself or to get what you think you want. And that's kind of an attitude that people have. What's the minimum amount that I have to do in order to get salvation? Like, I don't really want to get involved. I don't want to have a relationship or pray a lot, or please don't ever tell me to go to confession. But if I could just pay some money, say some prayers, maybe go to Station of the Cross, great, sure, I'll do that and then I'll be saved. And that's the wrong attitude to have, because salvation should not be about something that you buy or you do the bare minimum to have, because it's not about like an item to be gained. It's about a relationship of love to be had. So this underlying attitude of the laity plays a huge role into what the Reformation was responding to, and what Luther specifically was responding to, and Calvin and Zwingli. Next week, we're talking about the university system and scholasticism and medieval piety practices and humanism. And then we get into Luther and all the other people in the Reformation. I hope I drank water enough for people. If they had any questions, I'll take one more sip so that if anyone does have a last minute question, you can post it now. I'll drink slow. I'm really afraid you can just hear gross noises of me swallowing water. So I hope that's not happening for you guys. Thanks for tuning in and watching. I have a lot of fun doing this, so I'm excited to see everyone next week. Have a good evening.